I don't, Al was grabbing handouts because Jan was sick, but I don't know for sure whether he grabbed both of these or just one, but we can. Right. Everyone hold your breath.
I know.
So, all right, and we'll see. I don't know whether anyone else will come up or not, but they do great. If not, it's all right. All right, we ready to start, Norm?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, so again, continuing our study on conflict in the Holy Land. And today we're going to again, touch on some of the stuff at the end of the packet from last week, and then get into some other stuff this week. Again, two main sources are then last week we looked at that Bible study by Pastor Nabil Noor, who's a Palestinian Lutheran pastor in South Dakota. And this beginning stuff I think is from him, and then the rest of it comes from an article in Lutheran Witness that was first published in 2006, but republished a couple times as it keeps coming more and more relevant, by Dr. Lessing, who was an Old Testament professor at seminary when I was there, talking about the understanding of the land from a biblical perspective and going from there. And so that's what we're touching on today. All right, so, and again, these words are from Pastor Nabil. So it's important to note both the Jews and the Muslims fight for the land because they believe if they don't possess the land, their relationship with God is in danger. So we kind of touched on this, and there's a true zealotry among them that has religious overtones and religious undertones. Fighting between them will not stop until one is extinct. So kind of a nice pessimistic view of how things are going. But yeah, so each believes God promised to them a land, a nation, and a Messiah in the concocted manner they've concluded. And so paradise is directly connected to their possession of that land. All right. And again, we touched on some of these promises that we got that God gives in the beginning. So again, this all comes back to the promises that God made to Abraham about the land. And then from Abraham, God made promises both to Isaac and to Ishmael and to their descendants. And so we see that coming too. And so we've got then over the centuries, you've got the Jews claiming that they've got the land because God tells them to. Later, when Muhammad comes along and they go back to Ishmael, they go, well, wait a minute, these promises are to Ishmael, not to Isaac, and so the land's for us too. Because again, that's one of the Quran takes some of that stuff from the Bible and kind of flips it so that it's applying to Ishmael instead of Isaac. They claim that the Bible we have and the Hebrew scriptures that the Jews use it was corrupted, but they've got the true version now in the Quran. And so they get things like Ishmael's actually the one who's almost sacrificed, not Isaac, by Abraham, for example. So you've all got these promises about the land, and then you've got specifically, I mean, even the exact same pieces of land that are important to both. That I think I mentioned last week that the Temple Mount in the middle of Jerusalem is, of course, where the temple was, so important to the Jews. But after the second temple was destroyed, then the Muslims built the Dome of the Rock there, which is where they believe Muhammad ascended. So it's the third holiest site in Islam. And so you can't rebuild the temple without removing the Dome of the Rock. And so and in fact, when there's Muslim control over it, so you can't even do archaeological digs and stuff to check underneath to verify that the Jews were there first. And so it's a big mess kind of that way. But again, looking back at some of the promises, so God tells Abraham, for all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever. Again, kind of straightforward there, and if you're just interpreting it straightforward, then the Jews, both the Jews and the descendants of Isaac and descendants of Ishmael can both go, well, wait, this promise goes to us, that this land's for our descendants. God said so. But then you've got two different groups of people claiming the same bit of land. And then we talked to last week, again, so, what's the source of conflict? Sin. What's the source of the conflict between Isaac and Ishmael? Sin. God promises to make a nation out of Abraham and Sarah, even though they're old and can't have kids anymore. And so, but eventually they get impatient, and Sarah says, well, I've got this, servant woman named Hagar, who she could still have kids, so why don't you go to her, Abraham, and we'll have a descendant that way. And they do, but then Hagar gets full of pride and says, well, look, I got pregnant, my mistress couldn't, so she gets chased out, and then but then God comes to Hagar while she's on the run in the wilderness, and the angel of the Lord says to Hagar, behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. So the Lord hears. Kind of get both when in doubt. Again, remember in Old Testament in Hebrew, if there's an L in the name somewhere, you've got God's name in there. And then a couple verses later, then Hagar says, Hagar called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God of seeing, for she says, truly here I have seen him who looks after me. And so she sees, she actually gives God the first name that he gets that he doesn't give to his people. Says, you are the God who sees. Because God saw her even though she's off in the wilderness, despite all this bad stuff that's happened, God's still watching over her. God's promises says, well, it's the seed of Abraham, and you've got the seed of Abraham in you, so these promises are going to apply to you and your offspring too. But so when in doubt, then ultimately sin. All right. Any questions thus far? All right, and then so now we're back. Now we're to that second handout I gave you, mostly again from Dr. Lessing. So who does the land belong to? And again, this is focused on kind of the theological Bible things. He's not making any political or nationalistic claims one way or the other about things. Although, as we've talked about, that's when we try and do policy based on theology, it tends to create a mess all the way around. All right, so the land, land of Israel, the land we're talking about, well, who did it belong to? Well, back in Genesis 15, even though it's promised to Abraham, there's people there first, the Amorites, but then they're driven out, and so the Israelites possess the land for a while. And then the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans all claim ownership at times during the Old Testament.
What land are we talking about?
Yeah, the area around Jerusalem. So, what we call Israel or Palestine today. So again, if God made this promise that for politically this is going to be your land for eternity, well, we see even in the Old Testament that's not the case, because you've got hey Tom, I can give you stuff. There we go. All right. So, and we won't look up these Bible verses, but again, so all these different groups were in political control of the nation, of the land of Israel, just in the Old Testament. And then since the end of the New Testament period, so we've got the Romans, and then the Romans switches to the Byzantines. To the Eastern Roman Empire. You've got the under Muslim control for a bit in the middle. Then the Ottomans, finally, who control Turkey, and they control the Middle East. And then the British empires have all looked at the land too, and all said, mine.
I keep thinking about how, like in the U.S., every square acre, every acre in Iowa, for example, is owned by somebody.
Yeah.
And there, who owned the land?
Well, see, that's part, and we'll touch on it, that it's the that part of it was that the land was given to the people, but you also never really owned the land. It was always recognizing that it was in trust. You were stewards of God's land, not necessarily your land, but. All right, so generally speaking, the question of who owned Palestine was answered politically from 70 AD, when the Roman army crushed the Jewish rebellion and dismantled Jerusalem until the 1840s. Whoever had the military might and diplomatic ability owned the land. I mean, that's true in a lot of places, too. Again, the Old Testament declares that the land of Canaan, so approximately present-day Israel and Palestine, plus adjoining coastal lands and parts of what are now Lebanon and Syria, belong to the Lord. But part of that's from here, Psalm 24:1. Well, what belongs to the Lord? Here, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein, for he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers. So again, recognizing, ultimately God owns all the land. Everything belongs to God, and we're just stewards of it. He's the one who gave it to Israel in Deuteronomy, but he's also then the one who can take it away in Leviticus. And he's reminded that if you don't keep my commands, bad things will happen to you. Here we go. Land could not be permanently bought or sold. It could not be given away, let alone stolen or confiscated. Land in the Old Testament was always a means for the greater end, the coming of Jesus Christ in the fullness of time. But to a large extent, however, it was Israel's belief that it, not the Lord, owned the land that led to the northern kingdom's exile to Assyria and the southern kingdom's exile to Babylon. So again, who does the land belong to? Well, that's God's. Well, no, it's our land. We can do with it whatever we want. Well, then God says, well, no, this is both a symptom and an example of how you're not trusting me, you're not following my commands, you're going against what I've said, and so again they go to, you're supposed to remember God's in control, not you. They're not remembering that, and so then God sends them into exile. All right, and then in the New Testament, when Jesus speaks about the land in Luke 19:41-44, he makes no reference to it ever being restored to the Jews. And this is what's here. Can someone read this for us?
And when Jesus drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you. And they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation. Rather,
no. So that's the end of that quote. Sorry. So Jesus talking about Jerusalem, looking ahead to its upcoming destruction. He just says it's going to be destroyed and tells people to flee. He doesn't say anything about, and then you'll come back and have this land, and it'll be yours again. Because that's not how the promise is going to be fulfilled. All right. So rather, Jesus teaches his disciples to look forward not to a Jewish return to the land, but to the coming of the Son of Man in his glory on the last day. And this is the Luke passage, but and could someone read this?
There will be signs in sun, moon, and stars, and on the earth distress of nations in perplexity because of the roaring of the sea and the waves. People fainting with fear and with foreboding of what is coming on the world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Now when these things begin to take place, straighten up and raise up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. Jesus.
So when Jesus is talking about what they're looking forward to, is it about, hey, I'm going to come back and then we're going to restore the land? No. I mean, you have that kind of implicit expectation, and we'll touch on a little here that that in the New Testament times, that what a lot of that messianic expectation was that the Messiah would come and he was going to overthrow the Romans and give the people back their land. And the disciples are certainly, in that mindset too. But Jesus is saying, well, no, that's not what I'm here for. That's not what we're looking forward to. I'm not just here to give you back your land and overthrow the Romans. I'm not going to come back in power and great glory just to overthrow the Romans and give you back your land. I'm going to do something bigger than that. I'm going to save the whole world. And remind everyone that God made the world. God's everything belongs to God. All right. So Jesus makes only several explicit references to the land, and the Gospels. Strongest is in the Beatitudes when he says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." But he's not. So when he's quoting from Psalm 37:11, where the meek inherit the land, but here Jesus is saying the meek don't just inherit this land; they inherit the whole earth. It's not just about one little piece of land that we're concerned about. It's about the whole world. And again, in the light of the strong eschatological dimension of the Sermon on the Mount. So again, the Sermon on the Mount is pointing people ahead to what's going to come at the end of things. The earth is the new heaven, and the new earth the home of righteousness. So that's what we're looking forward to: a new heaven and a new earth, not getting this land back. All right. Any other thoughts, questions, comments there? All right, so again, until the day of Pentecost, the disciples shared the same nationalistic understanding of the land as other Jews of the first century. So both in Luke 24:21 and Acts 1:6, Jesus is, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Go, I'm going to ascend to heaven. And the disciples are like, so wait, when are you coming to restore the land to Israel? And she's like, no, that's not what this is about at all. I'm doing something bigger than that. And so at least until the day of Pentecost, they're still thinking that, and you still get a few glimpses of that here and there afterwards. But after the coming of the Holy Spirit on Pentecost, they begin to use Old Testament language concerning the land in new ways. One example who comes from Peter, who speaks of our inheritance that, unlike the land of Palestine, can never perish, spoil, or fade. That we've got something up in heaven that's waiting for us, not something here on earth that's going to just decay and things. I mean, we can even see that with the land of Palestine. In the Old Testament, it's described as a land flowing with milk and honey, this wonderful agricultural paradise. And there's parts of it that still are, but there's a lot of parts of it that are more deserty than they were then for a variety of reasons. And so, the land will perish and fade, but the inheritance we have won't. All right, and then we find in the book of Hebrews all sorts of examples of how the New Testament reinterprets what's in the Old Testament, partly about the land, that Christians have the land described as the rest into which they have entered through Christ in Hebrews 4, 1 through 11. Could someone read that for us, please?
Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For good news came to us just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them, because they were not united by faith with those who listened. For we have believed, enter that rest, as he has said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest, although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has somewhere spoken of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in this passage he said, they shall not enter my rest. Since therefore it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience. Again, he appoints a certain day, today, saying through David so long afterwards in the words already quoted, today, if you have heard his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, and whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. Let us therefore strive to enter that rest, so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience.
All right. So again, some of those Old Testament quotes talk about rest, and but the rest was the promise of, you're wandering through the wilderness. You've got to fight all these pagan nations, even the nations that are there already. But you're going to have rest and part of that promise is the rest in this land. And here the author of the Hebrews is saying, well, no, we're looking at something more than just the land in our rest. It's rest in God, the promised rest in eternity. All right. And then in Hebrews 11, 13 to 16, so this is in the early to middle part of that great chapter, the heroes of the faith. The motif in that part is the land pilgrimage of faith is set in three scenes: the land from which they set out in faith, the present context of wandering, and the hoped for homeland that is better, indeed a heavenly city. All right, could someone read this for us, please?
These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from far, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city.
All right. So, again, the focus is not on going back to the land. It's on going to the city that God's prepared, which, yes, for some of the people in the Old Testament, they were looking ahead to the land that God had promised to them. But more than that, they're looking ahead to the heavenly kingdom, heavenly city, heavenly land where that God's promised them, and not just some physical location. All right, that makes sense? Okay. All right. So again, ultimately, when the New Testament's allowed to interpret the Old Testament, it follows that the 1948 state of Israel is not a prophetic realization of the messianic kingdom of Jesus Christ, because his kingdom is not of this world. And so that's kind of the big conflict we see among Christians, and in our country especially, as we see these conflicts, people will say, oh, well, the Israelis have the right to do whatever they want in terms of fighting the Palestinians, because it's their land that God has promised them, and this is all part of this God's plan to fix everything before Jesus returns again. But it's, the way we interpret the Bible, that's not how it works, because this isn't, Jesus says his kingdom is not of this world. It's not going to look like that. And so just establishing a nation is not going to do anything one way or the other. Yeah, so then, furthermore, a day should not be anticipated in which Christ's kingdom will manifest Jewish distinctives, whether it's by its location in the land of Palestine, its capital in Jerusalem, its constituency, or its ceremonial institutions and practices. Which again, and we touched on this too when we talked about some of the end time stuff and those different views of, especially that premillennial dispensationalism kind of thing. And so some of those people think that, that Israel becoming a new nation was kind of a kickoff to when God would start things returning again, start the end times rolling again. That part of it was that the Jewish people would be saved by restarting their Old Testament practices. And so rebuilding the temple and offering sacrifices there again and all this stuff, instead of recognizing that, no, everyone is saved through Christ. The Jews don't get some special other way to be saved. Right, so the Old Testament needs to be viewed in light of Christ. Again, the land promises God gave to Abraham were made effective through Christ, Abraham's true seed. So that's another important point too, that as we look, God makes these promises to Abraham and his seed or descendants together, and usually that word seed in Hebrew is singular. So it's not plural, it's not his seeds, his descendants, it's one that's, ultimately Jesus. And so again, ultimately everything belongs to God. So all spiritual benefits are derived from Jesus, and apart from him, there's no participation in the promises made to Abraham. So you can't get to God without Jesus. The promises aren't directed towards any particular ethnic group. The church, not Jews or the Israelis, are the true Israel of God, and the baptized are the children of Abraham. Father Abraham had many sons, and I am one of them, and so are you. I won't make you stand up and do the motions, but there's no suggestion that that Jesus or the apostles believed the Jewish people still have a divine right to the land, or that the Jewish possession of the land would be important, let alone central aspect of God's plan for the world. Land was promised to Abraham, taken possession of under Joshua, lost in the Assyrian and Babylonian exiles, regained by Judah upon Cyrus's decree in 538 BC, and reinterpreted by Jesus, Paul, and others as the new heaven and the new earth. All right. So any thoughts, questions, comments there? Your brain is full. All right. All right, and then kind of finish up just to get a quick little timeline of what happens in the land, and as we're thinking and talking about that. All right, so you can get Abraham. You're going to have different scholars debating on when some of these earlier things happened. Abraham's usually kind of around 2000 BC. You can kind of try and get there based on if you take the genealogies in the Bible and add up the years. But so then when he's again commanded by God, he leaves Ur, a wealthy, corrupt city in what's today southern Iraq. Then he goes from Ur to Haran, and from Haran in southern Turkey, and then he goes to Israel and the land, and God promises to give him that land. All right. In 1450 BC, Egypt's pharaohs subjugate the Canaanites, including Abraham's descendants. 1250 to 1200, probably in this period, is when the Israelites enter the Holy Land after the Exodus from Egypt and reclaim the land from the Canaanites. There's some debates over when exactly the Exodus happened. There's a couple 100-year spots where they think things seem to line up for when that happened archaeologically. But And then King David and Solomon are about 980, 935 BC, when they have built, Israel's at its height, and Solomon's temple's built. And then 930 BC, shortly after Solomon's death, the kingdom's divided between the northern and southern kingdoms, so Israel and Judah. 722 is when the Assyrians conquer the northern kingdom of Israel. The 10 tribes are deported and disappear from history. So if you hear sometimes about the 10 lost tribes, that's how we get there. And then every so often you get find some weird little people groups that seem to be following Old Testament Jewish practices. I think there's a group in India that I think they've even done some genetic testing and have sort of kind of made it, that again. But again, that's part of how the Assyrians and Babylonians worked, is they conquered you and then they enslaved people and then sent them to the other side of their empire. So that's how you get people, all these scattered different places. All right, and then 606 to 581 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian army conquers Judah, destroys Jerusalem, including the temple, and the Judeans are taken back to Babylon. And then 539, the Medes and the Persians, so from modern day Iran, capture Babylon. God induces King Cyrus to allow the Jews to return to their land, and they rebuild the temple. 332 BC, Alexander the Great's Greek army sweeps across the Holy Land. And then 323, after Alexander's death, his generals Ptolemy in Egypt and Seleucid in Syria battle for the land. And we kind of talked about that in that time between the Testament stuff after the prophets. Right, and then in 63, Roman armies under Pompey overrun the land and begin a 600-year rule, and Herod the Great becomes ruler of Judea. All right. So then Jesus lives, call it 4 BC to 27 AD. Yeah. The monk who made the AC-BC divide was off by a few years, is how that works. Which basically, if King Herod dies in 4 BC, he can't have been trying to kill Jesus, after he's dead, really. All right, so then from 30 to 300 AD, the new faith Christianity, reaches out vigorously to the Gentiles, answering Christ's call to teach all nations and baptize them. All right, and then 330 is when the Christian Byzantine Empire begins, when Emperor Constantine's converted to Christianity. But then by 640 AD, Muslim armies drive the Byzantine Christians from the Holy Land, and they rule for a while from Baghdad. Again, Jerusalem's recognized as a holy city in Islam, and the Temple Mount is the place where Muhammad ascended to heaven. All right. Then from 1099 to 1291, the European Crusaders established the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. In 1516, the Ottoman Turks overwhelm the Holy Land, and it remains in Muslim control until World War II. And then in 1920, Britain installs monarchies in Iraq and Transjordan, and Transjordan, they're the group that governs Palestine. Fleeing Europe and Russia, Jews flood into Palestine from 1920 onward. Then in 1947, the United Nations divides Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish, one Arab. Jerusalem is to be administered by the UN to avoid conflict. Didn't quite work. Israel, populated by Jewish refugees from Europe, Africa, and Asia, proclaims itself a nation. Open warfare between the new Israel and its Arab neighbors makes refugees of Palestinians. And that's where we are now. All right. Any final thoughts, questions, comments? Yeah.
How closely aligned would be the Christian dispensationalists with present-day Orthodox Jews in their kind of interpretation of things?
I think you've got some overlap in terms of, that the Orthodox Jews would also want to drive the invaders out, rebuild the temple and get everything started. The worship, get all the worship and ceremonies and things started back up in the temple again. So in that way, there'd be some overlap. But of course, the Christians should see that as means to an end, not necessarily, the Christian dispensationalists see it as a means to an end, not necessarily as the end in itself. But yeah, good question, good thought. All right. Yeah. So, all right. So that will conclude there today. No Bible class the next 2 weeks. Reminder: we only have one service at 10 a.m. the next 2 Sunday mornings. In addition to the Christmas Eve services. But then, so then we'll start back again in the new year. And if you have any thoughts and questions, what you want me to do for Bible class,